John Sullivan was a man who had built his life in the wide, open plains of the American West. He was a rancher, tough and self-sufficient, and had spent many years living alone in a small cabin on the edge of the settlement. The land was harsh. The winds often howled like wolves at night, and the winters could freeze a man's soul. But John had learned to survive. He had learned the ways of the land, the rhythms of nature, and the unpredictable moods of the people who lived around him. Most people in the area thought of John as a loner. He rarely visited town, preferring the quiet of his ranch and the solitude it offered. Life was simple for him, tending to his cattle, fixing fences, and keeping the land in good shape. But on this particular evening, as the sun began to sink low on the horizon, everything was about to change. It had been a long day. John had spent the afternoon mending the broken fence near the north pasture. The sky was starting to turn gray with the promise of rain, and a chilly wind had begun to blow in from the mountains. John knew that a storm was coming. He could feel it in the air, that kind of stillness before the world seemed to hold its breath. The land was about to change, and so, it seemed, was his life. As John walked back toward his cabin, his steps slowed. He saw something in the distance, a figure stumbling slowly toward his cabin. It was a woman, and she looked as if she was in trouble. John had a sharp eye for danger, and something about the way she moved told him that she was in distress. He hurried toward her, his boots crunching on the dry earth. When he was close enough, he saw that the woman was young, perhaps no older than 20. Her clothes were torn, stained with dirt and blood. Her face was pale, and her dark eyes were wide with fear. She seemed disoriented, as though she wasn't sure where she was. She collapsed to her knees just as John reached her. "Hey there," John said, his voice gruff. He knelt beside her, his heart pounding. "What's happened to you?" The woman's eyes flickered up to meet his, and for a moment she didn't speak. Then, in a soft, almost whispering voice, she said, They attacked the tribe." Her voice trailed off, and she shivered, whether from fear or cold John couldn't tell. John's mind raced. There had been rumors of violence between the settlers and the Apache tribe lately. Tensions were high, and skirmishes had been breaking out all over the region. But John hadn't expected to be caught in the middle of it, let alone have someone from the tribe appear on his doorstep. "Who attacked you?" John asked, trying to keep his voice calm. He was no stranger to the dangers of the frontier, but he had never been in this situation before. The woman seemed to struggle to form the words, but after a few moments she whispered, "The settlers, they killed my people." Her breath caught in her throat, and she began to cough weakly. John knew that the Apache and the settlers had never gotten along, but hearing the words from the woman herself made everything feel much more real. He couldn't let this young woman die out here alone, no matter what had happened between their people. He had always believed that helping someone in need was the right thing to do, no matter their background. "Come on, let's get you inside," John said firmly. He gently helped her to her feet, steadying her as she stumbled. He guided her toward the cabin, his mind racing with questions. What was this woman doing out here? And why had she come to him of all people? The storm was closing in fast now. The wind was picking up, and the first drops of rain began to fall, hissing as they hit the dry ground. John hurried inside, leading the woman to the warmth of his cabin. It wasn't much, just a simple room with a fireplace and a few pieces of furniture, but it had always been enough for him. He quickly started a fire in the hearth, watching the flames crackle to life. The woman sank onto a chair by the fire, her body shaking with exhaustion. John grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. He didn't know what had brought her here or why she had chosen to come to him, but he couldn't turn her away now. "Rest," John said, his voice softening. "You're safe here. I'll make you something to eat." The woman didn't say anything, but she nodded weakly, her eyes closing as she leaned back against the chair. John watched her for a moment, his mind still working through the strange turn of events. He had heard stories of Apache warriors fierce and proud, but he hadn't expected to meet one like this, tired, hurt and seeking refuge. As John prepared some food, he couldn't help but wonder what her story was. What had happened to her people? Was she part of a larger group? Or had she been on her own when the attack occurred? He had questions, so many questions, but he knew that now wasn't the time to ask. For the moment, all he could do was help her recover. The woman's eyes fluttered open as he set a plate of food in front of her. She looked up at him with gratitude, But there was something else in her gaze, a mixture of fear and uncertainty. John could see that she was not used to this kind of kindness, not from someone like him. Her people, the Apache, were known for their strength, their pride, and their warrior spirit. But here she was, alone and vulnerable. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice still soft but stronger now. "I don't know where else I could go." John nodded, unsure of what to say. He had never been one to offer empty words, but in this case there was nothing more to say. He had done what any decent person would do. He had offered shelter to someone in need. "Rest," he repeated. "We'll talk more tomorrow." But as he turned to leave, a thought crossed his mind. Who was this woman really? And what would happen if her people came looking for her? Would they see John as an ally or as another enemy to fight? The storm outside grew stronger, but inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire offered a small comfort. As the night stretched on, John sat in his chair watching the woman sleep. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he was about to find out. The morning came quietly, with the sun peeking over the horizon, casting a soft light over the cabin and the land beyond. John Sullivan had spent a restless night, his mind turning over the strange events that had unfolded. He had never expected to find himself helping an Apache woman, especially one who was the daughter of a chief. The world outside was wild and uncertain, and he knew that the decision he had made to offer her shelter could lead to more trouble than he had bargained for. As the first light of day broke through the cabin windows, John got up from his chair, stretching his stiff limbs. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the wind outside had picked up again, signaling that the storm hadn't quite passed. He moved quietly toward the small stove in the corner of the room and began heating up water for coffee. The morning was still cool, and the warmth of the cabin was a welcome relief from the chill of the outside air. It wasn't long before he heard soft sounds from the corner of the room. Ayanna, the young Apache woman, was awake. She sat up in the chair where she had slept, her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her dark eyes met his, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was a tension in the air, a silent understanding that things between them were far from simple. John knew she was not like other people he had helped in the past. She was from a tribe that had been at war with settlers for years, and her people had been labeled as enemies by many. Yet here she was, sitting in his cabin, a guest he didn't know how to fully trust. John placed a cup of steaming coffee on the table in front of her, silently offering it as a gesture of goodwill. Ayanna looked at the cup but didn't take it right away. Her eyes were distant, lost in thoughts that John couldn't begin to understand. He didn't push her to speak. He knew she needed time. The silence between them stretched on, comfortable in its own way. Both of them were strangers to each other, yet there was a strange sense of mutual understanding forming. After a long pause, Ayanna finally spoke. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice tinged with something like regret. "I did not mean to bring trouble to your door." John raised an eyebrow, surprised by her words. "Trouble?" he repeated, leaning against the wooden table. "You didn't bring any trouble, not yet at least. You needed help and I gave it." She shook her head, a small frown appearing on her face. "The people who attacked, my people will come looking for me. I am their daughter. My father is the chief of our tribe. If they find me here, they will think you are a part of the enemy. They won't see a man who helped me. They will see a man who sided with the settlers." John had known that her presence in his cabin could lead to trouble, but hearing her say it aloud made it feel much more real. His stomach tightened as he thought of the Apache warriors, proud, fierce, and willing to fight for their land. He had heard the stories, the ones that painted them as ruthless enemies to the settlers, but now as he looked at Ayanna, he couldn't see the enemy at all. She was just a young woman, caught in the middle of something far bigger than either of them. "You don't need to worry about that," John said after a moment, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "I didn't help you because of who you are. I helped you because you needed help." Ayanna looked at him for a long time, her dark eyes studying him carefully. Finally, she took the coffee cup in her hands and sipped it slowly, savoring the warmth. She didn't say anything for a while, but her posture softened. The harsh tension in her shoulders seemed to ease as she relaxed just a little. "I never wanted this fight," Ayanna said quietly. "My people have lived in these lands for generations. We did not ask for war, but it came. The settlers pushed us into corners, and we had no choice but to defend ourselves. My father is a man of peace, but he has seen his people killed and his heart has grown cold with anger. He does not trust the settlers. John felt a lump form in his throat. He could understand the pain in her voice, the deep sorrow that came from losing loved ones, from watching a way of life being destroyed. But he also understood the settlers' fear. They had come to the West to build lives of their own, and the Apache were in their way. He wasn't sure what the answer was. He didn't know how to fix what had been broken. But he knew that Ayanna, in her quiet strength, wasn't just a victim of the war. She was a part of it just as much as he was. "I'm sorry," John said, his voice sincere. "I don't know what it's like to lose your people. But I do know what it's like to lose everything. This land, it's all I have. But maybe it's not all there is. Maybe there's something more." Ayanna looked up at him, her gaze softening. "Maybe," she said, almost to herself. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. John was still trying to make sense of the situation, of his decision to help this young woman, the daughter of a chief, a warrior from the Apache tribe. His heart told him it was the right thing to do, but his head told him that he could be making a dangerous mistake. Finally, Ayanna broke the silence. "I do not wish to be a burden to you. If it is safe, I will leave before my father finds me." John frowned. "You're not a burden," he said, his voice firm. "You stay as long as you need. But we'll have to figure out what to do if your people come looking for you." Ayanna nodded, her expression serious. "I know my father. He will come for me. He will not stop until he finds me." John sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Then we'll have to prepare. But we'll figure it out together. I'm not leaving you out there to fend for yourself." For the first time since their conversation began, Ayanna allowed herself a small smile. It was fleeting, but it was enough to tell John that she had begun to trust him, even if only a little. She hadn't asked for his help, but she had accepted it, and maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward something better. The days that followed were a mix of uncertainty and quiet. John and Ayanna spent most of their time inside the cabin, with the storm still lingering in the distance, much like the tension between them. The weather had turned colder, and the wind howled outside, but inside the small cabin the fire was always warm. For the first time in a long while, John felt like he wasn't alone, though he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that trouble was coming, just like the storm that refused to pass. Ayanna kept to herself, spending hours by the window, her eyes scanning the distant hills. John noticed the way she would tense up every time the wind picked up, as though she were waiting for something or someone. He knew she was thinking about her tribe, about her father. He could see the worry in her eyes, even when she tried to hide it. One morning, after a quiet breakfast of bread and stew, John went outside to check on the cattle. The weather had settled into a strange calm, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that things were about to change. Ayanna remained inside, sitting by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. It was a routine now. He would go outside to tend to his ranch, and she would stay inside, her presence like a shadow in the room. As he worked in the pasture, John kept an eye on the horizon, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. The wind had shifted, and the air felt different. There was a weight in the silence, as though the land itself was holding its breath. After a few hours of checking the cattle and repairing some of the fences, John headed back toward the cabin. He had just reached the clearing when he saw them, figures moving swiftly in the distance. At first he thought they were just travelers or perhaps a group of settlers. But as they drew closer, his heart sank. They were Apache warriors. John's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his shoulder, but he quickly stopped himself. He couldn't fight them, not when Ayanna was inside. He couldn't let things escalate. The Apache were fierce, and they didn't take kindly to anyone who threatened their people. He didn't know if these were part of Ayanna's tribe, but he couldn't take the chance. He had to get to her, warn her, and figure out what to do before they reached the cabin. John broke into a run, his boots kicking up dust as he made his way back to the cabin. The warriors were still a good distance away, but he could see them moving with purpose, their horses kicking up a cloud of dust behind them. There were at least a dozen of them, riding in a tight formation, and their eyes were focused on the cabin. John knew they had come for something, and it was likely Ayanna. He burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him. Ayanna was standing by the window, her eyes wide with fear as she saw the riders approaching. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. John quickly moved toward her, his mind racing. "We have to leave. Now." Ayana shook her head, her eyes filled with both fear and defiance. No, I can't run from my father. I won't hide from him. She stepped away from the window and turned toward him, her posture straight and proud. He will find me, John. He will never stop looking until he does. John could see the conflict in her eyes. She was torn between the safety of staying hidden and the loyalty to her people, especially her father. She was strong, he knew that much. But this wasn't something she could face alone. I won't let anything happen to you, John said firmly, his voice steady. You're not alone in this. But Ayana only looked at him, shaking her head. You don't understand. My father will not listen to words. He will see only betrayal. He will not care who you are or why you helped me. To him, you will be an enemy. John stood there for a moment, trying to process what she had said. It was hard to believe. He had never been part of any war between settlers and the Apache, but he could see now how deep the divide went, how real the hatred was. For Ayana, this wasn't just about survival. It was about honor, family, and duty. She couldn't just run away and abandon everything she had ever known. Before John could respond, a loud knock echoed from the door, followed by a voice calling out, We know you're inside, rancher. Open up. John's heart skipped a beat. He had no time left to figure out what to do. The Apache had come and they weren't going to leave without a fight. He knew that now. The question was whether he could protect Ayana and make it out alive, or whether he would have to face the consequences of his decision to shelter her. Ayana's eyes met his, and for a brief moment they shared a silent understanding. There was no turning back. They had both chosen a path and now they had to walk it together. John's hand gripped the rifle once more, but he knew that he couldn't just shoot his way out of this. The Apache warriors were too many, and he couldn't risk killing someone. There had to be another way. He thought quickly, his mind racing for any solution. Ayana, do you think you can talk to them? Calm them down? John asked, his voice urgent. Ayana's face hardened, but she nodded. I can try, but they will not listen easily. They are my people, but they are also warriors, and they will not forget who I am no matter what I say. John's mind raced, but there was no other choice. Then we have to try. I'll stand by you. Whatever happens. Ayana took a deep breath and nodded again. We will face this together. John moved to the door, carefully unlatching it. He opened it just enough to peer outside where the Apache warriors had stopped, waiting for a response. They were mounted on their horses, watching him intently. Their faces were stern, but John could see something in their eyes, a mixture of curiosity and caution. Ayana stepped forward, moving toward the door. She raised a hand, signaling for John to step back. I will speak to them, she said softly. John stepped back, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew that this moment would decide everything. Would Ayana's voice be enough to stop the warriors from attacking? Or would the storm of war come crashing down, sweeping them all into its fury? As Ayana stepped outside to face her people, John stood in the doorway, watching in silence. He could only hope that her strength, her courage, would be enough to bring peace to this troubled land. Ayana stepped outside, the cool wind rushing past her as she faced the group of Apache warriors. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land. But the warriors remained unmoving, their eyes focused on her. They were all mounted on strong horses, their dark eyes sharp and their faces unreadable. Ayana felt a tightness in her chest as she stepped forward. These were her people, but they were not here to offer help. They had come for her. John stood inside the cabin, his heart in his throat. He could see Ayana standing tall, her posture strong despite the fear that he knew must be inside her. He had never seen her like this before, so confident, so sure of what she was doing. But he also knew that the situation was delicate. If the Apache warriors didn't listen to her, there would be no way to avoid conflict. There were too many of them, and they wouldn't hesitate to fight if they felt threatened. Ayana raised her hand, signaling for the warriors to wait. The silence stretched between them, tense and thick with anticipation. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice calm but firm. I am Ayana, daughter of Chief Shikra, she said, her words carrying across the still air. I come in peace. One of the warriors, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, narrowed his eyes at her. You have abandoned your people, Ayana, he said, his voice cold. You ran away. You are no longer one of us. Ayana stood her ground, not flinching at the harshness in his tone. I did not abandon anyone, she replied. I am here because I have been hurt, but I still carry the honor of my people. I came to the rancher's cabin for help. There is no shame in that. The warrior shook his head. You have chosen a settler's cabin over the blood of your own. You have broken the bond with your people. John, who had been watching from the doorway, felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment he had feared. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for Ayanna to face her own people, to defend her actions. She had already lost so much, and now she stood between the life she had known and the life she hoped to build. Please, listen to her, John called out, stepping out of the cabin, his voice loud enough to be heard by the warriors. Ayanna did not seek trouble. She only wanted peace. The warriors turned to him, their eyes sharp and full of suspicion. The scarred warrior on the horse looked at John with disdain. You speak for her now, settler, he sneered. What do you know of our ways? You who have taken land that is not yours? John stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. I know enough to know that fighting won't solve anything, he said, his voice steady. I know that Ayanna came to me because she was wounded and needed help. She is not your enemy, and neither am I. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The warriors glanced at each other, and Ayanna's father, Chief Shikra, watched from his horse with a stern expression. John could see the weight of the situation in the chief's eyes. A man who had lived through endless battles, lost countless warriors, and seen his people pushed to the brink of extinction. Ayanna, the chief said finally, his voice deep and commanding. You have chosen your side, it seems. But remember, there is no place between two worlds. You cannot live with the settlers and still be Apache. Ayanna's eyes filled with emotion, but her voice remained firm. I have chosen nothing but survival, father. I did not want to leave, but I had no choice. The settlers attacked my people. But I believe we can find a way to stop this. We can find peace. Chief Shikra's gaze softened slightly, but only for a moment. Peace? He repeated, his tone almost bitter. Peace has not been found by words, Ayanna. It has been earned by blood. And now you stand here asking for peace with those who have taken our land and destroyed our families. John could feel the weight of the chief's words. There was no easy way out of this. The Apache were a proud people, and for them, peace had always come with great sacrifice. But John knew that fighting would only lead to more bloodshed. He had seen it before, settlers and natives clashing, each side believing they were in the right, until there was nothing left but destruction. We do not want war, John said, his voice rising a little with urgency. None of us. But we cannot keep fighting forever. We have to try something different. The chief's eyes narrowed as he studied John, as if weighing the man's sincerity. The other warriors shifted on their horses, their impatience growing. But it was clear that the chief was listening. There was a flicker of thought in his eyes, a moment of uncertainty, as if he were considering the possibility of peace for the first time in years. I will not allow my daughter to live among those who have killed our people, Chief Shikra said firmly, his voice cold again. But I will hear what you have to say, settler. If you can find a way to stop the killing, then perhaps there is something to discuss. John nodded, feeling a sense of relief, though he knew the path ahead would not be easy. We can start by talking. Let's bring the settlers and the Apache to the table. We need to stop this bloodshed before it destroys us all. Ayanna looked at her father, and for a moment their eyes met. She could see the hardness in his face, the years of conflict written in every line. But there was something else there too, a flicker of hope, as though he too was tired of the endless fighting. Ayanna is right, John continued. If we keep going down this path, there will be nothing left. But if we sit down and talk, maybe we can find a way forward. It's not going to be easy, but it's the only chance we have. The chief remained silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from Ayanna to John and then to the other warriors behind him. Finally he spoke. Perhaps we will talk, he said, his voice quieter now but still strong. But know this, settler. The Apache will never forget what has been taken from them. There will be no peace without understanding, and no understanding without sacrifice. John nodded, understanding the gravity of the chief's words. It wasn't going to be easy. Peace wasn't something that could be handed out. It had to be earned by both sides. Ayanna stepped forward, her hand reaching out to her father. Please, father, she said softly, let us try. For the first time, Chief Shikra looked at his daughter without anger, without the hardened resolve that had shaped him for so long. There was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of hope. We will talk, he said, his voice heavy with decision, but know that there is much to be done before any peace can be made. Ayanna nodded, her heart beating faster. She had spoken her truth, and now they had a chance for peace. But the road ahead was uncertain, and the path would not be easy. As the Apache warriors slowly turned their horses around and began to ride away, Ayanna felt a small but important shift inside her. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long while she felt like there was hope. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of something new. The days after the Apache warriors left John's cabin felt like a dream, but in truth they were a turning point. The tension that had hung in the air, thick and heavy, seemed to lift just a little. Ayanna and John both knew that nothing had been settled yet, but the conversation with Chief Shikra had opened a door that had been closed for too long. They were no longer enemies. They were two people willing to take a chance on something different, a chance at peace. Ayanna had stayed at the cabin helping John with the daily chores. She had proven to be skilled in many ways. Her knowledge of the land, her ability to track animals, and her resourcefulness made her a strong companion. Yet it was clear that her heart was not completely at ease. She would often stare out at the horizon as if waiting for something or someone, her thoughts far away. John, too, was changed. He had always been a solitary man, but the events of the past few days had taught him a lot about himself and the world around him. He had chosen to protect Ayanna when it would have been easier to turn her away. He had seen the war in her eyes, the struggle between loyalty to her people and her desire for peace. It wasn't just about the Apache and the settlers anymore. It was about finding common ground, something both sides had forgotten. It was on a clear morning several days after the Apache had left that John heard it, the sound of hooves. His heart raced as he glanced toward the hills. He recognized the riders before they even came into view. It was Chief Shikra, his warriors following behind him, riding with purpose toward the cabin. Ayanna was in the garden, pulling weeds from the rows of vegetables they had planted together. When she heard the sound of the horses, she stood up quickly, her heart beating fast. She knew what it meant. They were back. John met her gaze, his face serious. "It's time," he said, his voice low. "We have to face this together." Ayanna nodded. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had made the decision to speak to her father, to ask for peace. Now she had to show him that she was not just the daughter of the chief. She was someone who believed in something more than war. Together they walked toward the front of the cabin. As the riders approached, Ayanna's father, Chief Shikra, led the group. He looked just as strong and proud as he always had, but there was a slight softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It was as though the long years of fighting, the endless battles for survival, had left their mark on him, and now, for the first time in a long time, he was considering something different. The warriors dismounted, and Chief Shikra walked toward Ayanna, his gaze steady. "Ayanna," he said, his voice deep, "you have chosen a difficult path, but I have thought about what you said. There is no peace in this land, only blood and death. But maybe there is another way." Ayanna stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Father, I believe we can find that way. It won't be easy, but we have to try. The settlers are not all enemies. We have to speak with them, to find a way to live together." John stood behind her, watching the exchange. He had not expected Chief Shikra to come back so soon. But now that he was here, John knew that this was their chance, perhaps their only chance. "I will speak with the settlers," Chief Shikra said after a long pause, his eyes meeting John's. "But understand this, settler. My people have suffered. There is much to be done before trust can be restored. If you wish to talk of peace, then you must show us that you are willing to sacrifice just as we have." John nodded. "I understand," he said. "I don't expect this to be easy, but I am ready to do whatever it takes." Ayanna's father turned to his warriors, speaking to them in their language. They listened closely, and after a few moments they began to speak among themselves. Ayanna and John watched, waiting for the decision. The air was thick with anticipation. Would the warriors agree to the chief's plan? Would they be willing to listen to the settlers? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the chief turned back to them. "My people are ready to talk," he said. "But only if you meet us halfway. If the settlers are willing to listen, we will sit down and discuss what can be done." Ayanna's heart lifted. This was more than she had hoped for. It was a start, a fragile, tentative start, but it was a start nonetheless. "I will go with you," John said, his voice steady. "I'll speak with the settlers. I'll tell them what we've discussed here, and I'll make sure they understand that peace is the only way forward." Chief Shikra nodded. "Good. We will meet at the river. We will come with a small group and you will bring the settlers." The group of Apache warriors began to mount their horses, preparing to leave. Ayanna stepped forward, looking at her father with a mixture of pride and hope. "Father," she said softly, "thank you for listening. This is the first step. There is still much to do, but I believe it's worth it." Chief Shikra met her gaze. For a moment his expression softened. "You are strong, Ayanna. Stronger than I knew. I see now that you have chosen the right path." With that, the Apache warriors rode off, disappearing into the distance as they headed back to their camp. John and Ayanna stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. "It's not over yet," Ayanna said, turning to John. "But it's a beginning." John placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a reassuring smile. "It's more than I could have hoped for. We've taken the first step. Now we just need to keep walking." In the days that followed, John rode to the settlement and gathered the leaders to speak of what had been agreed upon. It was not an easy conversation. Many settlers were suspicious of the Apache, and others were unwilling to even consider peace. But John spoke with conviction, telling them of the meeting and urging them to come to the river for the talks. The day of the meeting arrived, and both sides, Apache and settlers, gathered by the river, watching each other with wary eyes. But Ayanna stood between them, a symbol of the new possibility. She had been the bridge that had connected two worlds, and now it was time for both sides to listen. The talks were slow, full of difficult words and hard questions, but over time, something began to change. Settlers who had once seen the Apache as nothing but enemies began to see them as people, as families with their own struggles and dreams. And the Apache, led by Chief Shikra, began to understand that not all settlers were the same. Some, like John, wanted peace, not conflict. It wasn't perfect. There were many disagreements and tensions were still high. But for the first time in many years, both sides were willing to listen. They were willing to try. As the sun set on that first day of talks, Ayanna stood with John looking out over the river. It was a new beginning, and though the road ahead was uncertain, they knew one thing for sure: peace was worth the fight.